This video is going to outline what a temporal phrase or what temporal phrases are so that you can use them effectively in your writing. To begin, we have to establish what temporal phrasing is. In short, temporal phrases are words that establish temporal relationships, relationships relating to time, between different elements in a sentence. Let us take a look at an example. Before starring in RRR, comma, Aliyah Bhatt had to learn how to speak Telugu. Now, in this context, we have the word before, and that introduces an introductory element. So the reader now knows that the main clause that follows happened before the element that's situated in the temporal phrase. And we can clearly establish a timeline in our mind where we have the main clause occurring before the temporal element in the introductory element. Let's apply this in an academic context. After securing approval from the Research Ethics Board, participants were recruited for the study. Now, in this context, we have the preposition after beginning the temporal phrase, and that tells the reader that the main clause is something that occurred after the introductory element and the process detailed in the introductory element. So the reader can now visualize that timeline. We see the temporal element framed in the introductory element of the sentence occurred before the main clause. This seems helpful. However, temporal phrases can sometimes be unnecessary and increase your word count. So to be concise, we want to know when and how to use them effectively. The problem with temporal phrases, some languages have no or limited tenses. Therefore, these languages require temporal phrases to establish timelines. Mandarin, Thai, Vietnamese, Greenlandic. Each of these languages have no or limited tenses and require temporal phrases to establish timelines. However, English doesn't always need these elements. So if a person is translating from a tenseless language like Mandarin to English, it's important to consider whether the temporal elements are necessary once we do add the tense. For example, the poem Nostalgia by Chinese poet Yu Zhongguo makes heavy use of temporal phrases throughout for poetic purposes. Let's read a line through the poem and forgive my horrible pronunciation. Hu lai a, sheng shu shi, yi feng ai dun fen mu. Now, this roughly translates to later, nostalgia is a low grave. We have the temporal phrase later, close out the comma, and then we have a verb tense later in the sentence. Now, because the verb tenses don't change form, whether they're past, present, or future in Mandarin, we desperately need that temporal phrase in the original Mandarin to establish that this verb occurs later than the previous lines in the poem. Translate this to English, though, the verb is changes to became. And this will establish a temporal relationship that the simple verb is wouldn't have done in the original Mandarin. In that context, you could conceivably get rid of the temporal phrase at the beginning of the sentence. In this particular context, I think that would be a bad choice because it would undermine the structure of the original poem. But we can see with this example how changing and translating the verb tense to one appropriate for English from a tenseless language could eliminate the need for an introductory temporal element. Let's try this in an academic context. And again, bear with my horrible pronunciation, particularly my accents. Guoku, Yanju, Renyuan, Zhaomei, Kanju, Jie. Now, roughly, this sentence translates to in the past, the researcher recruit participants. We have the temporal phrase in the past, and that's situating when the verb recruit took place. Keeping in mind that Mandarin is a tenseless language, the verb recruit only has one form. So we need this temporal phrase at the beginning to situate when that verb is occurring. Translated to English, the sentence becomes the researcher recruited participants. And we see the simple past is used for the verb recruited, and that eliminates the need for the temporal phrase. This is an ideal situation where you would want to get rid of the temporal phrase that is required in languages that are tenseless or that have limited tense. But in English, where there are so many different tenses, there's no need for those kinds of temporal phrases because the verb tense will already convey that for you. So, when should you use temporal elements? When establishing a temporal relationship or a relationship relating to time between your main clause and another element in the sentence, then the temporal clauses are ideal. If you are simply asserting when something happened, then simply rely on tense. So, a quick summary: temporal phrases establish temporal relationships, relationships in time, between different elements in a sentence. However, temporal phrases are sometimes redundant and take up word count. If the main clause is not temporally related to another element in the sentence, if it's not being compared in terms of a timeline to itself and another element in the sentence, then simply rely on your verb tense to indicate when the action is taking place. I hope that helps clarify when you should and shouldn't use temporal phrases. But if you have any questions, leave them below and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.